Walking the Void, a 1930s NYC construction story. The alarm clock did not ring. It never needed to. Sean Maguire's eyes opened at 4:30, same as every morning for the last 6 years. The room was black, not the soft black of countryside night he remembered from boyhood, where stars pressed through the curtains and the moon painted the fields in milk. This was the hard black of a New York tenement, a darkness made of brick and coal dust, and the breathing of too many people stacked too close together. He lay still for a moment, listening. Mary breathed beside him, slow and steady, one hand curled beneath her chin like a child. The radiator ticked and hissed in the corner, giving off just enough warmth to keep the frost from forming on the inside of the windows. From the apartment above came the faint creak of floorboards. Old Kowalski, the Polish carpenter, already awake too, already carrying his own invisible weight toward another day. Sean sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the edge of the mattress. The floorboards were cold through his socks. He reached for his trousers, folded over the back of the chair where he always left them, and dressed in silence. Every movement was rehearsed, automatic. The undershirt first, then the heavy flannel shirt with the frayed collar. The denim trousers, stiff with dried sweat from yesterday. The leather belt, cinched one notch tighter than last month. The suspenders over the shoulders, snapped into place. He did not turn on the light. He did not need to see. His hands knew the geography of this room better than his mind knew the geography of his own heart. The dresser, 3 steps to the left. The kitchen, 5 steps straight ahead. The boots by the door, tongues pulled open, laces loose, waiting like the mouths of patient animals. He stood at the window for a moment before moving to the kitchen. Through the grimy glass, he could see the first bruise of light along the eastern rooftops, a thin line of gray pushing against the winter dark. Somewhere below, a milk truck rattled over cobblestones. Somewhere a door slammed. The city stirred in its restless, endless turning. Today he would go back up. In the kitchen, he lit the gas burner with a match, the blue flame jumping to life with a soft pop. He filled the kettle and set it on the ring. While it heated, he opened the icebox nearly empty, a quarter block of ice melting in its tin tray, a bottle of milk, 3 eggs, the end of a loaf of bread going stale. He took 2 eggs and the bread. The 3rd egg he left for Mary. He cracked the eggs into the pan with one hand, a motion so practiced it required no thought. The fat sizzled. The kitchen smelled of iron and butter and gas. He stood watching the eggs cook, spatula in hand. And for a moment, his mind was perfectly empty. Just a man, a pan, 2 eggs turning white at the edges. But the emptiness never lasted. It came back like water filling a hole in sand. Tommy Brennan. The image rose unbidden. Tommy's face that last morning, grinning around a cigarette, cap pushed back on his head, saying something about the Dodgers. What was it? Something about a pitcher. Something that didn't matter. Something ordinary. And then the afternoon. And then the beam. And then the sound, not a scream. That was the thing people always got wrong. Tommy hadn't screamed. There was just a grunt, a short expulsion of breath, like a man surprised by a punch, and then the scrape of boot leather on steel, and then nothing. Nothing for a long, long time, and then, very far below, a sound that Sean would hear for the rest of his life. He flipped the eggs. His hands did not shake. They hadn't shaken yesterday either, not when it happened. Not when the foreman blew the whistle. Not when they all rode the hoist down in silence and stood in a circle around what was left of Tommy Brennan on the frozen mud. His hands were steady as girders. It was everything behind them that trembled. He ate standing up, the plate on the counter, chewing without tasting. He washed the plate, dried it, put it back on the shelf. He filled his lunch pail, 2 bread and dripping sandwiches, an apple going soft, a bottle of cold coffee. He buckled the pail shut and set it by the door next to his boots from the bedroom. Mary murmured something in her sleep. He paused, listening. She settled. He pulled on his boots, lacing them tight, double knotting the way he always did because up there, where he worked, a loose lace could catch on a rivet head and send a man stumbling, and stumbling up there meant dying. He pulled on his coat, heavy wool, patched at the elbows, bought second-hand from a pushcart on Orchard Street 3 winters ago. He set his flat cap on his head. He took the lunch pail at the door. He stopped. He looked back into the darkness of the apartment. He could just make out the shape of the bedroom doorway, the faint suggestion of the bed. Mary. He wanted to go back and say something. He didn't know what. Something true. Something that would matter if today was the day the steel didn't hold him. But the words wouldn't form, and the clock was ticking, and the building was waiting, and the beam didn't care what a man said or didn't say to his wife at 5 in the morning. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage and kerosene, and something older, something that had seeped into the walls over decades, the sweat of 10,000 tenants, their cooking, their sickness, their small daily desperations. Sean descended 5 flights in the dark, his boots echoing on the worn wooden steps. On the 3rd floor landing, a door was open a crack, and he could see a candle burning inside and hear a woman coughing. A deep, wet cough that went on and on, the sound of lungs drowning in themselves. Tuberculosis. Half the building had it, or would have it soon. Outside, the cold hit him like a wall. February in New York. The wind came off the East River carrying ice in its teeth. He pulled his collar up and bent into it, walking west on Delancey Street, his breath making brief ghosts in the air before him. The street was not yet fully awake, but already stirring. A fruit vendor setting up his cart, oranges bright as small suns against the gray morning. A newsboy huddled in a doorway, his stack of papers beside him, hands jammed in his pockets. 2 men sitting on an overturned crate outside a shuttered bar, sharing a cigarette passed back and forth between bare fingers. The breadline had already formed outside the Mission on the Bowery. Sean walked past it every morning. 30 men today, maybe 40, standing in a silent column that stretched down the block and around the corner. They stood with their shoulders hunched and their eyes on the ground, hats pulled low, hands in pockets or crossed over their chests. Men who had been machinists, clerks, shopkeepers. Men who had owned things. Now they stood in line for a cup of coffee and a piece of bread and the chance to feel, for one moment, that someone somewhere acknowledged they existed, Sean passed them without looking. Not out of cruelty, out of superstition. He believed, though he would never have said it aloud, that if he looked at them too closely, if he met their eyes, the bad luck would jump from them to him like a flea. And tomorrow, he would be standing in that line instead of walking past it. He had work. He had a paycheck. He was one of the lucky ones. That was what everyone said, lucky. He repeated the word in his mind as he walked, turning it over like a stone in his pocket, trying to feel its weight, trying to believe it. The sky was lightening to a pale, colorless wash above the rooftops. A trolley clanged somewhere to the north. Pigeons scattered from a fire escape overhead, their wings making a sound like shuffled cards. He walked steadily, his stride measured, a working man's walk, not fast, not slow, conserving energy the way a man learns to when his body is his only tool. And every calorie counts, 20 blocks to the site. He walked them every day because the nickel for the trolley was a nickel he couldn't spare. He saw the building before he saw the men. It rose against the brightening sky like the skeleton of something vast and prehistoric. A cathedral of naked steel, girders and columns and cross braces reaching upward floor after floor. 60 stories of open framework with the wind howling through it like breath through ribs. The derricks perched at the top like iron birds, their cables swaying. Somewhere up there, barely visible, a red warning flag snapped in the wind. The men gathered at the base in the gray morning light, stamping their feet against the cold, blowing into their hands, talking in low voices. There were maybe 200 of them, ironworkers, riveters, boltmen, connectors, signalmen. A tribe of hard men from hard places. Irish, Mohawk from Conowake, Newfoundlanders, a few Swedes. They came from places where the land had failed them or the sea had tried to kill them. And they had come here to this city, to this impossible work, because it was the only work that paid a man enough to keep his family from the breadline. Sean joined the group near the material hoist. He nodded to the men he knew. Big Paddy Sullivan, built like an ox, his enormous hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Eamon Doyle, skinny and sharp-faced, a cigarette behind each ear, always talking. Red Campbell, who wasn't red-haired at all, but had earned the name from the color his face turned when he drank, which was every night. These men, his men, the gang, nobody mentioned Tommy. It was like a hole in the air. Tommy should have been here, leaning against the chain-link fence, cap tipped back, telling some story about his cousin in Flatbush, or his mother-in-law's cooking, or the horse he'd been sure was going to win at Belmont, and didn't. The space where he should have stood was empty, and the men arranged themselves around it without looking at it. The way water flows around a stone. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Callahan, stood on an upturned bucket with a clipboard. He called names. The men answered. When he came to Tommy's name, Brennan, Thomas J., he paused, just for a second, and then skipped it, and marked something on his clipboard, and moved on. That was all. That was the ceremony. A man fell 62 stories yesterday, and today there was a half-second pause and a mark on a clipboard. Maguire, Callahan called. Here, Sean said. You're with Danny Corrigan today. Connecting gang north face, 61. 61. The same floor. The same section. Sean felt something tighten in his stomach, but his face showed nothing. He nodded. The material hoist was a steel cage on a cable, open on one side, barely large enough for 8 men standing shoulder to shoulder. It smelled of grease and rust and sweat. Sean stepped in with the rest of his gang, Patty, Eamon, Red, and the new kid, Danny Corrigan, who was maybe 22, and had the face of someone who had not yet learned what the world was capable of. Danny stood at the back of the cage, hands in his pockets, jaw set, eyes fixed straight ahead, was trying very hard to look like he wasn't afraid. Sean recognized the effort. He'd made the same effort himself 10 years ago on his first ride up. First time above 40. Sean asked him quietly. Danny glanced at him. First time above 30. Sean nodded. There was nothing to say to that. The cage lurched and began to rise. The ground fell away, the mud yard, the tool shacks, the trucks, the street, the vendors' carts, all of it shrinking as the cable hummed and the steel groaned. 10 floors. 20. The wind found them at 30, sliding through the open cage like a cold hand. At 40, it was no longer a hand, it was a fist. The cage shuddered. The cable sang a high, metallic note. Sean watched the city transform beneath them. The buildings that had loomed above from the street became things to look down upon, their rooftops flat and tar black, punctuated by chimneys and water towers, and the geometric patterns of clotheslines strung between fire escapes. The streets became narrow canyons, the people in them shrinking to specks, to ants, to nothing. The East River appeared beyond the rooftops, a dull metallic band reflecting the overcast sky, and beyond it Brooklyn, and beyond that, invisible but implied, the ocean. At 50 floors, the world became abstract. The grid of the city, its logic, its order, was visible now. The avenues running north like veins, the cross streets cutting east to west like ribs. From up here, New York made sense. From up here, it was beautiful. It was only from the street, from inside it, that the city became a maze of noise and filth and struggle. The hoist stopped at 60 with a clang. The men stepped out onto a platform of temporary planking that flexed beneath their boots. From here, they would walk the steel to their stations. Danny Corrigan looked out, and then looked quickly back. His face had gone the color of old paper. "Don't look down," Sean told him. "That's the first rule. The only rule. Down doesn't exist." The beam was 18 inches wide. 18 inches of cold steel, riveted and bolted, stretching 30 feet between 2 columns, with nothing below it but 60 stories of open air. And at the bottom, the frozen earth of Manhattan. Sean stepped onto it the way he stepped onto it every morning, with his whole foot flat and firm, toes feeling for the edge through the leather of his boot. His arms hung loose at his sides. He didn't hold them out for balance, not anymore. That was for new men. A man who'd been walking steel for years found his balance in his hips, in the micro-adjustments of his knees, in some instinct deeper than thought. He walked to the midpoint of the beam and stopped. Below him, the city yawned, a vast, tilting vertigo of concrete and glass and smoke. The wind pressed against his back, steady, about 15 miles an hour, The kind of wind that didn't knock you off, but never let you forget it could. He could feel the beam vibrating faintly beneath his boots. A low hum transmitted upward from the street through 60 stories of steel. The building's pulse. Behind him, Danny was making his way along the beam. The kid moved in short, careful steps, his arms out, his body rigid. Every few steps he stopped and stood very still, as if the beam might suddenly decide to buck him off like a horse. Sean watched him from the corner of his eye, but didn't turn around. You didn't watch a man too closely on his first walk. It made him self-conscious, and a self-conscious man was a dead man up here. The connecting gang's job was straightforward in theory and lethal in practice. A derrick swung a new beam into position. The connectors, Sean and his partner, caught it, guided it into place, and bolted it to the columns on either end. The beam weighed anywhere from 400 to 1,000 pounds. It swung on a cable at the end of a crane, twisting in the wind, and you had to grab it with your hands and wrestle it into alignment while standing on another beam with nothing beneath you but God's indifference. That was the work. That was what they paid him $11 a day to do. $11, good money. The best money a working man could earn in this city. In this year of our Lord 1931, when $11 was the difference between a roof and the street, between food and hunger, between a man and a ghost. Sean pulled on his work gloves and waited for the first beam to swing in. While he waited, while the derrick cables groaned and the crane swung its load into position, Sean's mind drifted, the way it always did in the waiting, back across the ocean, back across the years, to a place so different from this steel sky that it might have been another planet, County Cork. The farm. 20 acres of rocky hillside where his father had raised sheep and tried to grow potatoes, and failed at both with the stoic persistence of a man who had never known any other life. The house was stone, 2 rooms, a thatch roof that leaked in winter, a hearth that smoked. His mother kept it clean with a ferocity that bordered on madness, as if cleanliness were the one thing standing between them and the chaos that pressed in from every side. The rain, the mud, the poverty, the slow erosion of hope. Sean was the third of 5 children, and the only son to survive past infancy. His 2 brothers, Michael and Patrick, were buried in the churchyard before they could walk. He grew up flanked by sisters, a serious boy in a house of women with a silent father who communicated mainly through the angle of his shoulders and the depth of his silences. The farm couldn't hold him. It could barely hold itself. By the time Sean was 18, it was clear that the land would give back exactly what it had always given, just enough to keep a man alive, and not one thing more. His father understood. When Sean told him he was going to America, the old man nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had always known. He didn't try to stop him. He didn't offer advice. He walked to the dresser and took out an envelope with 43 pounds in it, his life's savings, money hoarded over decades in coins and small notes, and held it out without a word. Sean took it. They shook hands. His father's hand was hard and dry and cracked. the hand of a man who had spent his life arguing with stone. They did not embrace. That wasn't the way. You left or you stayed. Either way, you didn't make a show of it, his mother cried at the door. His sisters cried. The dog followed him down the lane to the road, and then stopped, as dogs do, at the boundary of its known world, and watched him go. He sailed from Cobb on a Tuesday in April of 1921. He stood at the rail and watched Ireland become a green line on the horizon, and then a suggestion, and then nothing. He was 20 years old. He had never been more than 12 miles from the place he was born. America was noise. That was the first thing. A wall of noise that hit him when he stepped off the ship at Ellis Island, the roar of voices in 100 languages, the clanging of bells, the shriek of whistles, the rumble of engines, the whole city vibrating like a tuning fork struck by a hammer the size of God. He passed through the lines at Ellis Island in a daze. Doctors looked at his eyes, his teeth, his hands. A man with a badge asked him questions he barely understood and wrote things on a card. Another man stamped a paper and pointed toward a door. He walked through it, and he was in America. Lower Manhattan swallowed him the way a whale swallows a minnow. He found the Irish neighborhoods, the tenements of 5 Points, then Hell's Kitchen, then the Lower East Side, following the trail of accents and familiar faces, sleeping in flop houses for 15 cents a night, eating at soup kitchens, looking for work. He dug ditches. He hauled bricks. He unloaded freight on the docks, standing in the shape-up every morning with 100 other men, hoping the hiring boss would point at him. Some mornings he was chosen. Most mornings he wasn't. He lived on bread and apples and cold coffee. He shared rooms with men who drank themselves blind every Saturday night and wept for their mothers on Sunday morning. He learned the geography of poverty, which missions gave food, which cops could be reasoned with, which corners to avoid after dark. He learned that America was not the golden place the letters home described. It was a machine, and it would use you until you broke. And then it would replace you with someone who wasn't broken yet. 3 months in, half-starved and desperate, he met a man in a bar on 10th Avenue who told him the ironworkers were hiring. "Can you climb?" the man asked. Sean said he could. "Are you afraid of heights?" Sean said he wasn't. Both answers were lies. The first was half true. He'd climbed rocks and trees as a boy, which was not the same thing as climbing steel 60 stories above the street. The second was purely false. Everyone was afraid of heights. The question was whether you could carry the fear with you without letting it steer. He showed up at a construction site the next morning, and a foreman looked at his hands and his shoulders and said, "You'll do." That was how it began. No training, no safety instruction, just a man pointing at a ladder and saying, "Go up." Beam coming in. The shout cut through Sean's memory like a knife. He snapped back to the present, the wind, the steel, the 60-story void beneath his boots. The derrick cable was swinging a fresh beam toward them, a 20-foot length of structural steel spinning slowly on its line, the tag lines trailing below it like the tentacles of some industrial jellyfish. Sean grabbed the tagline and pulled, guiding the beam toward the connection point. Danny was on the other end, 15 feet away, reaching for the second tagline. The beam came in fast, swinging in the wind, and Sean braced his legs and leaned into it, feeling the mass of it through the rope. 700 pounds of steel with its own ideas about where it wanted to go. "Easy," he called to Danny. "Let it come to you. Don't reach." Danny reached. That was what new men did. They reached because the instinct was to grab, to control, to fight the weight. But you couldn't fight 700 pounds. You had to work with it, redirect it. The way a man on a river works with the current rather than against it. The beam swung wide. Danny stumbled backward, and for one terrible instant he was off balance, his arms wheeling, his right foot sliding toward the edge of the beam he was standing on. Sean felt his own heart stop. Not again. Not today. Not this kid. But Danny caught himself. He dropped to one knee, one hand slapping the steel, and held. The moment passed. He stood up, his face white, his jaw locked, and reached for the tagline again. And this time he let the beam come to him. They guided it into position. Sean pulled his spud wrench from his belt, a heavy, tapered tool, half wrench, half lever, and drove it through the bolt hole, aligning the new beam with the column. The holes matched. He slid in the first bolt, threaded the nut, and tightened it with quick, sure turns. Danny did the same on his end. The beam was set. Sean stood up and looked at Danny across the 30-foot span of steel. The kid was breathing hard, his nostrils flared, but his hands were steady on his wrench. He'd held. He hadn't panicked. That was something. "Good," Sean said. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. By 9 o'clock, the riveting gang was at work, and the building sang with their rhythm. The process was ancient in its simplicity and brutal in its demands. 4 men, 4 jobs, each one dependent on the others, a chain that could not break. First, the heater, a man crouching over a portable coal forge, a coke fire burning white-hot in a steel basket, heating rivets until they glowed cherry red. He worked with long tongs, turning the rivets in the coals, watching the color not too pale, not too dark, the exact shade of red that meant the metal was soft enough to form, but hard enough to hold. When the rivet was ready, the heater tossed it. Not handed it, not passed it, tossed it. Threw it through the air, sometimes 20 or 30 feet across open space, a glowing point of metal arcing through the wind like a small comet. And at the other end, standing on a beam with nothing below him, the catcher, a man with a tin can on a long handle, who snagged the rivet out of the air as casually as another man might catch a baseball. The catcher plucked the rivet from the can with tongs and shoved it, still glowing, into the prepared hole. Then the bucker-up, pressing a heavy steel dolly against the head of the rivet from inside, holding it in place with his whole body's weight while on the other side. The riveter, the 4th man, swung a pneumatic hammer against the protruding end, flattening it, mushrooming it, sealing the joint with a sound like the world's angriest woodpecker, bang, 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 bang. The sound was enormous, physical, a percussive assault that shook the steel and rattled the teeth and made conversation impossible. It echoed off the columns and the beams and the temporarily laid floor planks, bouncing around the skeleton of the building like thunder trapped in a cage. You felt it in your chest, in your bones, in the fillings of your teeth. By the end of a shift, your ears rang with a high, thin whine that didn't fully stop until sometime in the middle of the night. And by morning, it was time to start again. Paddy Sullivan was the riveter in Sean's section. His arms were like bridge cables, and he swung the pneumatic hammer with a precision that belied its violence, each blow landing in exactly the same spot, flattening the rivet head in a perfect circle. He worked with his eyes half closed, his jaw set, his body rocking with the rhythm of the hammer. And sometimes, in the brief silences between rivets, he hummed old songs from Galway, songs his mother had sung, though you couldn't hear them over the noise. You could only see his lips moving. It happened at 10:30. Sean was on the beam, waiting for the next section to swing in, his hands empty, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. He was thinking about nothing, or rather, about the particular kind of nothing that was actually about everything. The low hum of awareness that kept a man alive up here. The wind, the vibration, the angle of his body, the position of his feet. The gust came from the north, sudden and sharp. A fist of cold air that punched through the skeleton of the building and hit him broadside. His right foot slipped. Not much, half an inch, maybe less, but half an inch on an 18-inch beam 60 stories above the ground was the difference between living and dying. His body reacted before his mind could. His left hand shot out and closed around a vertical bolt that protruded from the nearest column, closed around it with a grip so tight that later, when he pulled off his glove, the pattern of the bolt head was embossed in his palm like a brand. His right foot found the beam again. His weight settled. He stood still. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. No one saw it. Danny was at the far column, his back turned. The riveting gang was 20 feet below, on the 59th floor, hidden behind a temporary plank wall. The wind blew on, indifferent. The building hummed. Sean stood motionless on the beam and waited for his heart to slow. It took a long time. He could feel it, not just beating but slamming, throwing itself against his ribs like an animal in a cage, and his breath came in shallow pulls that tasted of steel and cold air. His legs trembled. For the first time in years, he felt the height, not as an abstract concept, not as a professional hazard, but as a physical reality, a cosmic mouth open beneath him, patient and enormous and hungry. He thought about Tommy. He thought about what Tommy had felt in the last 3 seconds of his life. The sudden absence of steel beneath his feet, the air rushing up, the ground rushing down, and in between that helpless, weightless, screaming knowledge that this was it. This was the last thing, and it could not be stopped or bargained with or undone. He took a breath. He unclenched his hand from the bolt. He checked his footing. He looked straight ahead, not down, never down, and he waited for the next beam. And when it came, he caught the tag line and pulled. Lunchtime. The whistle blew at noon, 3 short blasts, and the work stopped. The hammers fell silent. The derricks paused mid-swing. The building, for 30 minutes, held its breath. Sean sat on a beam on the 61st floor, his legs dangling over 500 feet of nothing, his lunch pail open on his lap. Below him, the city spread out like a map drawn by a patient god. The grid of streets, the blocks of buildings, the dark rectangles of parks, the silver threads of rivers on either side, the bridges arcing over them like stitches in skin. To the south, the Woolworth building stood alone in its Gothic elegance, still the tallest thing in lower Manhattan. To the north, the Chrysler building gleamed in the midday light, its steel crown catching the sun, and beyond it, faintly, the green smudge of Central Park. The men ate in clusters, scattered along the beams and planks, their legs swinging, their laughter carrying on the wind. From the street, they would have been invisible dark specks against the steel lattice, indistinguishable from the rivets and bolts that held the building together. Up here, they were men with sandwiches and thermoses and opinions about everything. Boxing, baseball, politics, women, the price of beer. Roosevelt don't know his elbow from his rear end, Red Campbell announced through a mouthful of ham sandwich. No politician does. They sit in their offices in Washington, and they don't know the first thing about working men. And you do, Eamon Doyle said, lighting a cigarette. You, who bet his last nickel on a horse named Lucky Boy that came in dead last. That horse was interfered with, Red said with dignity. That horse was asleep, Patty said. The men laughed. Sean chewed his sandwich and said nothing. He watched Danny Corrigan, who sat alone at the end of a beam, eating in silence, his back pressed against a column. The kid's hands were steady now, but his eyes had the distant, inward look of a man recalculating his relationship with gravity, a man learning that the ground was not a right, but a privilege. Sean unwrapped his apple, soft and browning at the bruised spots, and bit into it. The juice was sweet. A gust of wind tugged at his cap. 500 feet below, a taxi honked. Up here, the sound was faint as a whisper, a ghost of a noise from a ghost of a world. A world that, for the 8 hours of his working day, did not exist. It was during lunch, in the silence between jokes, that Sean let himself think about Tommy. They had met 7 years ago, on a site in Midtown, the construction of some hotel whose name Sean had forgotten. Tommy was a catcher, new to the work, skinny and quick and loud. He talked constantly. He talked while he worked, while he ate, while he rode the hoist up and down. He talked about his wife, Bridget, who made the best soda bread in Brooklyn. He talked about his 3 daughters, who he described as 3 hurricanes in braids. He talked about Ireland, which he'd left at 16 and idealized with the fierce nostalgia of a man who had never actually enjoyed being there. They became partners. On the steel, a partner was more than a friend. He was a second pair of eyes, a counterweight, a reason to pay attention. You trusted your partner with your life, literally, every minute of every day. You learned his rhythms, his habits, his tells. You knew when he was tired, when he was distracted, when his mind was on something other than the beam. You watched him the way a man watches the weather, constantly, carefully, because the moment you stopped watching was the moment everything changed. Tommy was good. Not the best. He was too reckless for that, too willing to take chances, to lean a little too far, to reach when he should have waited, but good. Fast, brave in the careless way of a man who believed, deep in his bones, that the bad thing would happen to someone else. That was Tom. The bad thing was always going to happen to someone else, until Tuesday Sean had replayed it 100 times. They were on 62, connecting a diagonal brace. The wind was moderate, 12, maybe 15 miles per hour. Nothing unusual. The beam came in on the cable, swinging wide, and Tommy reached for the tagline. He reached too far. His left foot stayed on the beam. His body went past his center of gravity. It was a slow thing. That was the horror of it, how slow it looked. Tommy leaning, Tommy tilting, Tommy's hands grasping at air that offered nothing. And then Tommy gone, folded into the void between one heartbeat and the next, and Sean standing there with his hand outstretched, reaching for a man who was already falling, reaching into empty air, reaching. He stopped thinking about it. He closed his lunch pail. He tightened his jaw. He looked out at the city and thought about nothing. And the nothing was enormous and cold, and it had Tommy's face. The afternoon was the hardest part. Not because the work was harder. It was the same bolts, the same beams, the same wind. But because by 2 o'clock the body's adrenaline had burned away, and what was left was pure endurance. The muscles ached. The fingers, despite the gloves, were stiff and clumsy with cold. The wind, which in the morning had been an adversary worth respecting, became by afternoon a torturer, relentless, personal, finding every gap in clothing, every inch of exposed skin, driving the cold into the marrow like nails. Sean worked steadily, mechanically, his body performing its routines, while his mind floated somewhere above, watching himself from a distance. Connect, bolt, wrench, move. He'd done this so many times that the movements had grooved themselves into his muscles, like water wearing channels in stone. His body knew the work the way a pianist's hands know the keys, without thought, without decision, simply happening. The wind strengthened through the afternoon, gusts hitting 30 miles an hour, and the beam beneath his feet began to vibrate with a low, ominous frequency, like a tuning fork humming a note just below the threshold of hearing. The temporary planking laid across the lower floors rattled and banged. A loose sheet of tin roofing somewhere below tore free and went spinning into the void, turning end over end, flashing in the gray light like a playing card thrown by a giant. Danny worked beside him, quieter now. The morning's bravado burned away by exhaustion and cold, and the accumulating weight of fear. Kid moved carefully, every step deliberate, and Sean could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept his center of gravity low, the way his eyes tracked every gust of wind as if it were a living thing trying to outsmart him. "You're doing fine," Sean said during a pause between beams. Danny nodded, but didn't speak. His lips were blue. His nose was running. He wiped it on his sleeve and went back to work. Sean watched him and thought, he'll either last or he won't. There was no middle ground up here. A man either made peace with the height or he didn't. And if he didn't, it ate him. The fear grew bigger each day instead of smaller, until it filled his whole body, until his hands shook and his legs locked, and his mind screamed at him to get down, to get off, to never come back. Sean had seen it happen. Men who walked the steel for months, and then one morning simply couldn't. They stood at the base of the hoist, and their bodies refused. It wasn't a decision. It was something deeper than decision. Something in the animal brain, the old brain, the part that knew what falling meant before language existed to describe it. Those men went away. They found other work, worse work, work that paid less, work that didn't require them to argue with gravity every day. But they lived, and that was something. That was not nothing. 3 o'clock, the sky darkened. Not gradually, the way evening comes, but all at once, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. The clouds that had been high and thin all morning thickened and lowered, pressing down on the city like the lid of a box. The light went flat and gray, leaching the color from the steel, from the buildings below, from the men's faces. Everything became the same shade of lead. Callahan's voice came up from below, carried by the wind. Keep working. We're not stopping for weather. Of course not. They never stopped for weather. They stopped for lightning. Even Callahan wasn't crazy enough to put men on steel in a lightning storm. But rain, sleet, wind, cold, these were not reasons to stop. These were conditions. A man worked in conditions. A man who couldn't work in conditions was replaced by a man who could. The first drops hit at 3:15. Not rain exactly. Something between rain and ice. A cold, stinging mist that coated the steel in a thin film of water and turned every surface into something treacherous. Sean felt it immediately, the change in friction beneath his boots, the subtle shift from grip to slide. He shortened his steps. He moved his weight forward over his toes. He kept one hand near a column or a bolt at all times. Watch your footing, he called to Danny. The kid nodded, already hunched against the wet, his cap pulled low, water dripping from the brim. The riveting gang slowed. You couldn't throw a cherry red rivet through rain. The water cooled it mid-flight, and a cooled rivet wouldn't form properly, wouldn't fill the hole, wouldn't hold. The heater cursed and sheltered his forge under a scrap of canvas. The catcher stood with his tin can, waiting, water streaming down his face. The wind picked up. 35 miles an hour, maybe more. The building swayed, not visibly, not to someone standing on the ground. But Sean felt it in his feet, in his knees, in the deep equilibrium of his inner ear. A movement so slight it was more intuition than sensation, like the memory of a wave felt long after stepping off a boat. He gripped his wrench and waited. The rain came harder. The sky pressed down. The beam was slick beneath his boots, and the city below had disappeared into mist, into fog, into a gray absence, as if the ground itself had withdrawn, leaving nothing beneath him but cloud and the long, long fall. They worked through the rain. Of course they did. What was rain? Rain was water. Water was nothing. A man could drown in water, yes, but he could also drown in debt, in sorrow, in the slow accumulation of days without purpose. Up here in the rain, on the steel, Sean was neither drowning nor floating. He was simply enduring. The way he had endured everything, the farm, the crossing, the tenements, the years of labor, with the grim, silent persistence of a man who had learned early that the world did not reward complaint. His hands were numb inside the gloves. He could barely feel the wrench. He tightened bolts by sound, the pitch of metal against metal telling him what his fingers couldn't. Tight enough, not tight enough, too tight. It was a skill learned over years. One of 100 small competencies that kept a man alive on the steel, and that no one outside the trade would ever know about or appreciate. Danny was struggling. Sean could see it. The kid's movements had become jerky, uncertain. His confidence eroded by the cold and the wet and the accumulated terror of a day spent arguing with death. At one point, Danny stopped mid-beam and just stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on something that wasn't there, or rather on the thing that was always there, the void, the down, the space below the steel that a man was not supposed to look at or think about, but that was always, always present, like the bass note in a piece of music, the one you felt rather than heard, Danny. Sean's voice was steady, firm, the voice of a man giving an order, not asking a question. Look at me. Danny's eyes found him. Just the next bolt, Sean said. Don't think about the one after that. Just the next one, Danny blinked. Water ran down his face. He nodded. He moved to the next bolt. He tightened it. He moved to the one after that. That was how you survived up here. Not by conquering the fear. The fear was unconquerable, as permanent as the steel itself, but by narrowing your focus until the world was small enough to manage. Just this bolt, just this step, just this breath. The future didn't exist. The past didn't exist. There was only the beam, the wrench, and the next 6 inches of steel. Sean had learned that from the old-timers, the men who had been walking steel since before the war. Men with sun-cured faces and hands like leather gloves, who moved along the beams with the casual grace of cats on a fence line. Don't look down and don't look ahead. Old Jack Morin had told him once, years ago. A man who looks ahead sees how far he has to go, and that's what kills him. Just look at where your foot is. That's the whole world, right there. Jack Morin was dead now. Fell off a beam in 1928. But his words lived on, passed from man to man, a kind of oral tradition, the wisdom of the tribe. Brace. When he heard the sound, a metallic clatter from above, sharp and wrong. The sound of something falling that shouldn't be falling. He looked up. A bolt gun, 3 pounds of pneumatic steel, was tumbling down from the floor above, knocked from a plank by someone's careless boot, falling in a slow, lazy spiral directly toward Danny Corrigan. Danny, move. The kid reacted. Not fast enough. Fast enough would have been impossible, but enough. He threw himself sideways, and the bolt gun passed through the space where his head had been a half-second earlier, and struck the beam with a sound like a gunshot, bounced once, and went spinning into the abyss below. Danny was on his stomach on the beam, arms wrapped around it, face pressed against the wet steel, his body shaking. He didn't get up. He lay there, clinging to the beam, the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. And Sean could hear him breathing fast, ragged, the breath of an animal in a trap. From above, a voice called down. "Sorry. You all right down there?" Sean didn't answer the voice. He walked the beam to where Danny lay, stepping carefully over the kid's legs, and crouched beside him. He put his hand on Danny's back. He could feel the trembling through the kid's coat, through his shirt, through his skin, a vibration deep enough to be coming from the bones. "Take a minute," Sean said quietly. "I can't." Danny's voice was muffled against the steel. "I can't do this. You can. I can't. I'm going to fall. I know I'm going to fall. You're not going to fall. You're lying on a beam that's bolted to a column that's anchored in bedrock. You couldn't fall off this beam if you tried." Danny was quiet for a long moment. Rain pattered on the steel around them. The wind moaned through the skeleton of the building. "That thing that fell," Danny said, "couple inches closer." "But it wasn't," Sean said. "Couple inches is a mile up here. You're here. You're alive. That's what matters." Danny lifted his face from the steel. His cheek was imprinted with the pattern of the beam's surface, rust and rivet heads stamped into his skin like a brand. He looked at Sean with eyes that were old suddenly, older than 22. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Every day. How do you come back?" Sean considered the question. It deserved an honest answer, but the honest answer was that he didn't know. He came back because the alarm went off. He came back because the rent was due. He came back because there was nothing else to do, no other work that paid, no other place to go. He came back because stopping would mean admitting that the fear had won, and a man who let the fear win had nothing left. "Because I have to," Sean said. "Same as you." He remembered his own first day on the steel, summer 1921. A building going up on 6th Avenue, some office tower, 12 stories, nothing compared to what they were building now. The foreman had pointed at a ladder welded to a column and said, "Up." Sean climbed. His hands shook on the rungs. His legs shook. Everything shook. At the top, 40 feet, barely 4 stories, an old man was sitting on a beam, eating an apple, his legs crossed beneath him like a tailor on a table. The old man's name was Jack Moran. He was 50-something, Irish from Donegal, with a face like crumpled leather and eyes that had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. He looked at Sean the way a farmer looks at a new horse, assessing, clinical, unsentimental. "First time up," he said. Sean nodded. He was gripping the column so hard his knuckles were white. "Walk to me," Moran said, gesturing at the beam that connected Sean's column to the one where Moran sat. It was a 12-inch beam, 20 feet long, with a 4-story drop on either side. Sean looked at the beam. He looked at the drop. His body said no. Every nerve, every instinct, every million-year-old piece of genetic programming screamed at him to climb back down, to return to the ground, to never leave the earth again. He stepped onto the beam. The first step was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than leaving Ireland. Harder than the Atlantic crossing. Harder than anything that came before or would come after. He placed his foot on the cold steel and felt the void open beneath him like a mouth, and his vision narrowed to a tunnel, and his heart beat so loud he could hear it in his ears, drowning out the city, drowning out everything. He took a second step, a third. He didn't breathe. He didn't think. He simply moved, one foot in front of the other, the way a man walks in a dream, and the beam was narrow, and the air was wide, and the ground was far below, invisible, irrelevant, because he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at Jack Moran's face, at the old man's calm, untroubled expression, at the half-eaten apple in his hand. He reached the other side. He sat down on the beam next to Moran and realized he had stopped breathing. "Good," Moran said. "Now do it again." He did it again, and again, and again, every day for weeks, until the beam was not a foreign country, but a familiar road, until his body stopped screaming and started listening, until the fear, which never went away, which was always there, a permanent resident in the back of his mind, shrank to a manageable size, small enough to carry, small enough to work alongside. That was the secret they never told you. The fear stayed. You just learned to work with it. At 4:30, the light changed. It happened suddenly, the way it sometimes does in winter. The clouds thinned at the horizon, and the low sun broke through, flooding the city with a golden light so rich and warm that it seemed to belong to another time, another world. The rain had stopped. The wind eased. The steel around Sean caught the light and held it glowing. And for a few minutes the building was not a skeleton, but a cathedral. Every beam a column of amber, every rivet a point of fire. Sean stood on the beam and looked out at the city. And despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the fear, the grief, he felt something stir in his chest that was difficult to name. Not happiness, not peace, something older and simpler, the pure animal sensation of being alive in a high place, of seeing far, of standing where no man was meant to stand, and standing there anyway. The city spread below him like a dream of itself. The skyscrapers caught the golden light on their western faces and threw long shadows to the east. The rivers turned to molten copper. The bridges, the Brooklyn, the Manhattan, the Williamsburg, hung like necklaces of light over the darkening water. Smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys in straight columns, undisturbed now by the wind, rising into the clear sky like prayers or signals or the exhaled breath of the city itself. He could see, to the northwest, the other great buildings going up, the Empire State, rising block by block, already taller than anything around it, a monument to the mad ambition of a nation that was simultaneously building the tallest building in the world and standing in breadlines to eat. That was America. That was the country he had come to. A country that could do both things at once and see no contradiction. Danny came and stood beside him, and for a moment the two of them were silent, looking out at the city in the last light. Danny's face was still pale, still marked by the afternoon's terror, but his eyes were different now, wider, softer, filled with something that might have been awe. "It's something, isn't it?" Danny said quietly. Sean nodded. "It's something." They stood there until the foreman's whistle blew. 5 o'clock. 3 sharp blasts on Callahan's whistle, cutting through the still air. End of shift. The sound released something in Sean, a tension held so deep in his muscles that he had forgotten it was there. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched, his fingers, still wrapped around his wrench, slowly opened, and the wrench hung from its tether on his belt, swinging against his hip. The descent was always strange, The hoist cage clanged shut. The cable hummed. The city rose to meet them. Or rather, they sank toward the city, floor by floor, the wind diminishing, the sounds of the street growing louder, the world thickening around them like water closing over a diver's head. At 40 floors, Sean could hear the traffic. At 30, the individual sounds separated: horns, engines, voices, the screech of a trolley's brakes. At 20, he could smell the street exhaust and roasting chestnuts, and the omnipresent smell of the city itself. That mineral, human, indefinable scent of concrete and sweat and ambition. They reached the ground. Sean stepped out of the cage and onto the frozen mud of the yard. And for a moment, the solidity of the earth felt wrong, too stable, too certain. A stillness that his body, after 8 hours of micro-adjustments and constant balancing, did not trust. His legs felt strange, like a sailor's legs after a long voyage, seeking the roll and pitch of a deck that wasn't there. He stood still and let the ground claim him. His boots pressed into the mud. His weight sank. He was down. He was alive. Another day carried. Another day survived. Another $11 earned. The men dispersed quickly, the way working men always do. No lingering, no ceremony, just the quick exchange of nods, the muttered "see you tomorrows," and then the scattering into the evening city, each man carrying his own exhaustion home like a sack of tools. Sean hung back. He had something to do tonight, something he'd been putting off since yesterday. He reached inside his coat and touched the envelope in the inner pocket, Tommy Brennan's last pay envelope. Callahan had handed it to him that morning with the simple instruction: give this to Margaret. Not please. Not when you get a chance. Just give this to Margaret, as if delivering a dead man's last wages were as routine as delivering a rivet. He supposed, for Callahan, it was. Tommy's family lived in a 4th-floor walk-up on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. Sean took the subway, spending the nickel he couldn't afford, because walking would have taken 2 hours, and this was not something a man should do in the dark. It should be done while there was light. It should be done with some fragment of day still remaining, some suggestion that the world had not entirely given up on brightness. He climbed the stairs slowly. The hallway smelled of boiled meat and soap, and the particular staleness of air that has been breathed too many times. Voices leaked from behind closed doors, arguments, laughter, the thump of feet running on bare floors. A radio played faintly, some swing tune, the notes tinny and distant. He stopped at the door, 4C, the number painted in black on pitted wood, and stood there for a long moment with his hand raised to knock. He could feel the envelope in his pocket, pressing against his chest like a second heart. $23. That was Tommy's last shift. $23 for a man's last day on Earth. It seemed like a number that should mean something, but it didn't. It was just a number he thought about turning around. He could mail the envelope. He could slide it under the door. He could give it to the priest at St. Patrick's and let the church handle it. There were 100 ways to avoid this moment. 100 exits from a room he hadn't yet entered. He knocked. The door opened. Margaret Brennan stood in the yellow light of her kitchen, a dish towel in her hands, her dark hair pinned back, her face composed in the careful, fragile way of a woman who has been crying for 2 days and has decided to stop because there are things that need to be done, and crying does not do them. "Sean," she said, not surprised, as if she'd been expecting him. Perhaps she had. "Margaret, he stopped. He reached inside his coat and took out the envelope. He held it out. From Callahan, Tommy's pay. She looked at the envelope. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it the way a person looks at the last letter from someone who has died, knowing that once it's opened, once its contents are absorbed, there will be nothing more to wait for. She took it. "Thank you. I'm sorry, Margaret. I know." They stood in the doorway, the light from the kitchen falling between them like something solid. Behind Margaret, the apartment was small and neat, filled with the evidence of a life interrupted. Tommy's coat still hanging on its hook by the door, his shoes beneath the radiator, a newspaper folded on the kitchen table to a page he would never finish reading. Margaret didn't invite him in, and he was grateful for that. She leaned against the doorframe, the envelope held against her stomach, and she asked the question he had been dreading since yesterday. Was he scared, Sean? At the end, was he scared? Sean looked at her face. The face of a woman who needed something, not truth, not facts, but something to hold, a story she could live with, a version of her husband's last moments that she could carry forward into the years of his absence without drowning. The truth was that Sean didn't know what Tommy had felt. The fall had been fast, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Sean had seen Tommy's face for only an instant, the half second between the slip and the vanishing. And what he'd seen, there was not fear, but surprise. The open-mouthed, blank-eyed look of a man confronting something impossible. Not the fact of falling, but the fact that falling was happening to him, to Tommy Brennan, who had walked steel for 7 years without a scratch, who had always been the lucky one, the charmed one, the one who leaned too far, and somehow never went over. That was the truth. But the truth was no use to Margaret. "No," Sean said. "He wasn't scared. It happened fast. I don't think he felt anything." Margaret's eyes searched his face. She was looking for the lie, and she found it. He could see that she found it. The way a tremor passed across her expression. A flicker of something that might have been gratitude or might have been resentment. But she accepted it. She took the lie and folded it up and put it away somewhere inside herself, the way she might file a document in a drawer, and she nodded. "He talked about you," she said. "All the time. Said you were the best partner he ever had. Said he trusted you more than anyone up there." Sean felt something break inside him, not dramatically, not with a sound, but quietly, the way a rope breaks after too much tension, one fiber at a time, until the whole thing unravels. He blinked. He looked at the floor. He looked back at Margaret. "He was a good man, Margaret. I know what he was. If there's anything you need, I need him to not be dead, Sean. Can you do that?" He had no answer for that. Nobody did. Stood there for a moment longer, 2 people on either side of a doorway with a dead man between them. And then Margaret stepped back and began to close the door. "Thank you for bringing the pay," she said. "Good night, Sean. "Good night, Margaret." The door closed. He stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of her footsteps moving away from the door, into the kitchen, into a life that would now be lived without the man she had built it around. He turned and walked down the stairs and out into the Brooklyn evening. Rain again. A light, persistent drizzle that coated the streets in a sheen of reflected light. The headlights of passing cars, the neon signs of bars and diners, the street lamps with their halos of mist. Sean walked through it without hurrying, without direction at first, just walking. The way a man walks when his body needs to move, but his mind doesn't know where it's going. He crossed the Brooklyn Bridge on foot. Below him, the East River moved in black, oily silence, carrying the city's reflections on its surface like a river of broken light. The bridge's cables rose above him in great sweeping arcs, and the towers stood like the pillars of a cathedral. And he thought, not for the first time, about the men who had built this bridge. The caisson workers, the cable spinners, the ironworkers who had walked these beams 50 years before he was born. 27 men had died building this bridge. Their names were not on it. Nobody who walked across it, or drove across it, or rode the trolley across it knew their names or thought about them, or paused for even a moment to consider that this structure, this daily convenience, this postcard background, was built on the bones of men who had fallen from it. That was the contract. The unwritten, unspoken contract that every ironworker signed with his body. You build the thing. If you fall, they replace you. When the building is done, your name is not on it. The architects get the credit. The owners get the money. The engineers get the legacy. The men who actually put the steel in the sky, bolt by bolt, rivet by rivet, beam by beam, they get $11 a day, and the chance to do it again tomorrow. Sean walked and thought about Tommy. Not the moment of the fall. He was tired of replaying that, but the other moments. The lunches shared on high beams, legs dangling, sandwiches unwrapped in the wind. The jokes, Tommy's terrible jokes, the ones that made you groan even as you laughed. The morning cigarettes, shared in the cold. The conversations about nothing, baseball, boxing, the weather. The sort of small, disposable talk that fills the space between men and makes the silence bearable. He'd lied to Margaret. He'd told her Tommy wasn't scared. That was wrong, but it was the right kind of wrong. A lie that served mercy rather than cruelty. A lie that would let her sleep tonight and tomorrow night, and maybe the night after that. The truth, that Sean didn't know what Tommy had felt, that he'd seen only surprise, that the whole thing had been too fast for fear, was a more honest answer, but a less useful one. What good was an honest answer that gave no comfort? He walked off the bridge into Manhattan and turned north, toward home. The apartment was warm. Mary had kept the stove burning. The air smelled of potatoes and onions, and something with meat in it, a stew, probably, made from whatever she'd found cheap at the market. Sean hung his coat on the hook, set his lunch pail on the counter, unlaced his boots, and sat down at the kitchen table without speaking. Mary set a bowl in front of him. Stew, as he'd guessed, potatoes, onions, a small piece of beef, carrots gone soft with cooking. She sat across from him and didn't eat. She watched him. She was 31. She had been pretty once, in the way of Irish girls, dark hair, fair skin, a mouth that turned up at the corners when she smiled. She still was pretty, but the prettiness had thinned, the way paint thins on a wall exposed to weather, the colors fading, the surface growing worn. The city had done that. The tenement, the worry, the years of watching him leave before dawn and counting the hours until he came home alive again. How was it? She asked. The question was ritual. She asked it every evening. It meant, are you hurt? It meant, did anyone fall? It meant, will you be going back tomorrow? Fine, he said. The answer was ritual too. It meant, I'm here. It meant, I'm whole. It meant, yes, I'll be going back, they ate. The stew was good. Mary was a good cook. She could make a meal from nothing, which was useful because nothing was often all they had. They ate in silence, the comfortable silence of people who have long since said everything that needs to be said, and are now just living in the same space, sharing the same air, the same food, the same uncertain future. After dinner, Sean washed the dishes, while Mary darned socks in the armchair by the window. The radio played quietly, a news broadcast, the announcer's voice describing unemployment numbers, bank closures, some political speech. Sean turned it off. He didn't want to hear about the world's problems tonight. His own were heavy enough. I went to see Margaret, he said, his back to Mary, his hands in the dishwater. A pause. How is she? How do you think? Another pause. The girls. I didn't see them. Mary's darning needle paused. Sean, he waited. Maybe you should think about something else. Some other kind of work. He dried a plate and set it on the shelf. He dried another plate. He wrung out the cloth and hung it over the faucet. There is no other kind of work, Mary. Not that pays. You know that. I know what it pays. I also know what it costs. He turned and looked at her. She was sitting in the chair with the darning in her lap, the needle between her fingers, her eyes steady on his face. Not angry, not pleading, just stating a fact, the way she stated all facts clearly, without drama, with the quiet precision of a woman who had learned that drama was a luxury she couldn't afford. He wanted to tell her she was right. He wanted to tell her that every morning when he stood at the base of the building and looked up at the steel skeleton reaching into the sky. Something inside him said no, said stop, said enough. But what came after enough? What came after he walked away from the only work that kept them in this apartment, kept food on this table, kept the lights burning and the stove lit, the bread line? That was what came after. I'll be careful, he said. Mary looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to her darning. The needle rose and fell. The sock took shape. Outside the window, the rain fell on the fire escape and made small sounds like tapping fingers. He lay in bed and listened to the clock tick, 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 the sound of time being divided into its smallest pieces, each one identical to the last, each one carrying him forward toward the moment when the alarm would ring and the day would begin again. The same day, the same sequence, the same terrible, necessary journey from this bed to that beam and back. Mary slept beside him, her breathing slow, and even one hand resting on the pillow above her head. In sleep, she looked like the girl he'd married, younger, softer, the worry lines smoothed away, the tension gone from her jaw. He watched her, and felt a love so tangled with guilt and fear that he couldn't separate the strands. He loved her. He was afraid for her. He was afraid of what would happen to her if he fell, and he was afraid of what would happen to both of them if he didn't go back up. The ceiling was cracked. A water stain spread across one corner in a shape that, if he squinted, looked like a map of someplace, Ireland, maybe, or the coast of Maine, or nowhere in particular, just a shape made by water and gravity and time. He stared at it, and his mind moved in circles Tommy's face. The beam. Margaret's voice. I need him to not be dead. Danny's hands shaking on the wrench. The bolt gun falling, spinning, missing the kid's head by inches that felt like miles. The golden light at 4:30. The city spread below him like a kingdom no one had ever asked for. The wind, the rain, the endless, indifferent height. He thought about the building they were constructing. When it was finished, it would be a monument, a tower of glass and steel, offices and lobbies and elevators, a place where men in clean suits would sit at clean desks and do clean work, and never once think about the men who had put the steel in the sky above their heads. The building would stand for 100 years, maybe more. The men who built it would be forgotten before the first tenant moved in. That was all right. Sean didn't need to be remembered. He didn't need a monument or a plaque or his name carved in stone. He needed $11. He needed Mary to sleep without nightmares. He needed the alarm clock to ring at 4:30, and his boots to be by the door, and the morning to be cold, and the building to be there, waiting unfinished, needing his hands and his weight and his willingness to walk where the air was thin, and the ground was far, and the margin between living and dying was 18 inches of cold American steel. The clock ticked. The rain whispered against the window. Mary breathed. Somewhere in the building, a pipe clanged and someone coughed, and a door opened and closed. Sean lay still and waited for morning. He didn't sleep, but he rested a shallow, watchful rest, the rest of a man whose body knows it will be needed soon and is saving its strength. His eyes were open. The ceiling stared back. The crack in the plaster ran from corner to corner like a fault line, like a fracture in the surface of things. And beyond it, if you looked hard enough, if you looked with the eyes of a man who had spent his life looking at structures and their weaknesses, you could almost see the sky. Tomorrow he would go back up. The alarm clock glowed faintly in the dark, its hands crawling toward 4:30, and the city hummed and breathed and turned in its restless, mechanical sleep. And the building waited patient, skeletal, unfinished, for the men who would come with the morning to climb it and shape it and give it, bolt by bolt, rivet by rivet, the bones it needed to stand. Thank you for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye, my friends.